Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first lecture now of Unit 3. Unit 3 covers the period from 1820 roughly to 1865. We call it A Nation and Its Discontents. This will take us through the end of the course this semester, and we start today with the first lecture, that is the first video lecture of the unit on the Market Revolution, Part 1. America's Material Development, 1815 to 1840. In this lecture, we're going to take a look not only at how the young nation's economy was beginning to mature and to modernize, but also how something like a national culture was beginning to develop as well that would give identity to the people living in the United States during these years of material development. Following the War of 1812, America looked inward to the potential for material development and the growth of market conditions. America's treaty with Great Britain opened the door for her western expansion and the rise of new cities connected to the western trade routes, connecting the interior of the Mississippi Basin with the Atlantic seaboard. And so for the first time, really, the American people begin to cohere around a shared set of economic goals and material impulses that see them looking in particular inwardly, that is, geographically speaking, inwardly to the interior of the country, particularly the Mississippi Basin region and the Ohio Valley Basin, to develop the manifold material interests that would begin to define the country in its age of independence. A new market revolution, as the historian Charles Sellers calls it, a new market revolution would integrate the far spaces of America's growing landscape. And this was given voice by many politicians and editors of the age, including John C. Calhoun, a congressman from South Carolina, who will become Secretary of War in the Madison administration. "We are great and rapidly growing," pronounced Calhoun. "This is our pride and danger, our weakness and our strength. The more enlarged the sphere of commercial circulation, the more extended that of social intercourse, the more strongly are we bound together, the more inseparable are our destinies. Let us then bind the Republic together with a perfect system of roads and canals. Let us conquer space." The memorable phrase of Calhoun, "Let us conquer space," again gave voice to the material ambitions of Americans to establish an infrastructure that would bind together the various corners of the young republic, which already had expanded significantly out to the frontier of the Mississippi River. Already a significantly large territorial state was the United States, with less than half of its continental growth still to go. The immediate need was to somehow make these regions connect so that those living on the frontier of the Mississippi would see their material interests connected with the Atlantic seaboard and not turn toward, say, the foreign nations that still had interests in the far western region, Spain, for example, or Great Britain up in the northwest. These foreign powers still seem to harbor designs on the material interests of the Trans-Mississippi West. And so it was definitely in the nation's interest, certainly in the interest of its new government in Washington, D.C., to make sure that the material interests of its people rallied around a common American purpose. And what better way than to motivate by opportunities for land and wealth in what was then the western frontier of the United States, as I say, the Ohio Valley and Mississippi Valley Basin. A city like Cincinnati, Ohio, would in the coming decades flourish and prosper with a whole new set of material interests as Americans embraced a belief in progress. As Senator Henry Clay from Kentucky put it, the almost universal ambition to get forward. In the words of Hezekiah Niles, the almost universal ambition to get forward, in the words of Hezekiah Niles, a popular publisher of the age, chimed perfectly with Senator Clay's own exclamation that a passion as unconquerable as any with which nature has endowed us, a passion as unconquerable as any with which nature has endowed us, as how Clay framed this material ambition. You may attempt to regulate it, he said, but you cannot destroy it. And so cities like Cincinnati, which begin to appear on the western frontier, the western borders of the United States, the Queen City of the West, as Cincinnati was called, begin to give tangible definition to these new and material interests. I love this portrait because it shows not only the rising cityscape in what was a new and vital city on that western boundary, but also by virtue of river transport, the new steamships, which are now lining the docks of Cincinnati, suggesting the arrival of modernity, even as the frontier was still sorting itself out in terms of population and material interests. Subsidized by the U.S. government, these projects of internal improvements, projects that involve the building of canals, the dredging of harbors and rivers, the building of roads, etc. Probably most famously was the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, an extraordinary undertaking, really a modern marvel for the time. The Erie Canal connected the vast Mississippi Basin and Great Lakes region with the markets of the Atlantic world available on the eastern coast. And so you see here how in New York, the Erie Canal connecting Lake Erie by means of a canal with the Hudson River, which of course flowed into New York Harbor and thus the larger Atlantic world. 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep and 360 miles long, it was derisively called Clinton's Ditch by its critics after the New York governor who convinced the New York legislature to appropriate $7 million, an astronomical sum at the time, $7 million for its construction. And I tell you, the Erie Canal reminds us that from the very beginning of our nation's material development, that government subsidy and government organization was central to the greatest economic prospects. And I say that because it's sometimes suggested by those who oppose government intervention and government regulation and government initiative in our own time. It's sometimes suggested that somehow there was a good old days in American history in which private enterprise and individual initiative took the place of all government participation. But frankly, that's not true. More, I think, accurate is the idea that government intervention, government regulation, government money was indispensable to the development of the country's infrastructure and its most ambitious programs. Private enterprise, private market capitalism, certainly critical as well, but never separate or far apart from that of the government's own supportive initiatives. Certainly Americans were a people who seemed to worship machine technology in this early age of industry. America's first factory, established in 1814 at Waltham, Massachusetts, a textile factory, and 20 years later a new factory town in Massachusetts called Lowell, which you see here in this image, dedicated to machine-driven textile production. By 1850, Lowell had 52 mills with more than 10,000 workers. This was the beginning of America's Industrial Revolution, a revolution given voice by Edward Everett on his dedication of the Lowell mills. Everett spoke that day In the classic oratory of the 19th century, it is the spirit of a free country, he said, which animates and gives energy to its labor, puts the mass in action, gives it motive and intensity, sends it off in new directions, subdues at its command all the powers of nature, and enlists in its service an army of machines that do all but think and talk. So an extraordinary enthusiasm and support for what seemed now to be the dawn of a great modern age, an age of infrastructure, of capital, of machinery and factories that would rearrange the very population of the country, marshal its resources, and send what was still a farmers' republic, a small town, farm-centered nation, rocketing into the 19th century, transforming itself into a town, or into a nation, yes, of farmers, but also of towns and cities, of manufacture, of merchandising, of transportation. The nation itself was being transformed. All of this dictated that life be lived according to new rhythms, as illustrated in one of the most popular American short stories of the 19th century, Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle. Rip Van Winkle tells the story of a small-town New Yorker, published in 1819, a fictional New Yorker who just before the American Revolution, that is, looking backwards to the American Revolution, famously takes a nap, but not just any nap, a 20-year nap. And when Rip Van Winkle wakes up, the sleepy little village where he lived was gone entirely, and his place was a town full of strangers who were too busy to pay him much attention. It seems that time had passed him by and made Rip Van Winkle a stranger in his own home. And everything's changed, and I'm changed, and I can't tell what's my name or who I am, said Rip. And the narrator intones, the very character of the people seemed changed. There was a busy, bustling, disputatious tone about it, instead of the accustomed, drowsy tranquility. And from the artist's rendition here, we see Rip coming back to his town, now an old man with a long white beard and an old smoothbore musket falling apart at the locks, greeted by a new generation of Americans who see him as an oddity, something from the past, their own confusion mirrored in Rip's confusion. Two ages, only 20 years apart, but in other ways, a whole history apart. Well, had the country really changed that quickly, so soon? One measure of how life's rhythms had changed concerned the speed at which information now traveled. In Rip Van Winkle's traditional world, news from the outside came, quote, by chance, when an old newspaper fell into their hands from some passing traveler. The narrator says how deliberately, how sagely they would deliberate upon public events some months after they had taken place. So an almost humorous view of the revolutionary generation in small towns like in upstate New York, where Rip Van Winkle was residing, that is, outside news came only when a passing traveler might leave a newspaper behind, and usually then the news was already out of date. Of course, all of that was changing. The market revolution inspired a revolution in printing and the dissemination of information. The steam-powered cylinder press lowered the cost and dramatically increased the volume of printed materials. There were 200 newspapers in America in 1801 and 1,200 by 1835. By 1840, America had more newspapers than any other country and almost twice as many as Great Britain. Newspapers made up 90% of the mail sent in the country. Other publications included magazines, books, and tracts. A kind of information revolution spawned by the larger market revolution. A powerful force in shaping culture and opinions was the printed press. An example, Godey's Lady Book, shown here, a frontispiece from 1867. Godey's had begun in 1830, called Godey's Lady Book. Ladies' Book. It was a popular magazine that reached a circulation of some 40,000 subscribers by 1849 and an estimated 150,000 by 1860. It featured articles, short stories, and poems by some of America's best-known writers, including Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, but also included popular songs and illustrations of fashionable dress. So quite a cultural arbiter, you might say, was Godey's Ladies' Book for over 40 years. Printed words also fueled other cultural happenings, including religious revivals in what was being called now the Age of the Second Great Awakening. The American Bible Society, established in 1816 in New York City, was producing 70,000 printed Bibles a year by 1820, while the American Tract Society, a sister organization of the American Bible Society, produced countless thousands of religious tracts and pamphlets for distribution as part of what was being called a new benevolent empire of publishing and preaching. In fact, enterprising preachers followed the mart of religion and the streams of commerce that developed in the age of the market revolution to find Christian converts with money to spend on benevolent enterprises such as missionary work, Bible publishing, and moral reform causes such as temperance. Charles Grandison Finney was a lawyer-turned-revival preacher who attracted large audiences in the 1830s by preaching a message of salvation in the towns of upstate New York, especially those along the path of the Erie Canal. Many of his converts were themselves enterprising businessmen involved in the market revolution and had money to contribute to various causes, such as Finney's Church on Broadway in New York City, a sparkling new edifice that allowed and accommodated for large revival meetings and sermons attended by throngs of New York City residents who were eager to support the enterprise of religion. Just as the market revolution promised upward mobility for industrious, young, working people on the make, so too did the new religion of the age seem to mirror that enterprising spirit and promised upward mobility, spiritual upward mobility for those who followed the zealous new evangelical word of the day. Moral reform causes were organized nationally. It wasn't enough to save oneself, to save the individual soul. This was religion in the age of enterprise and sought to, in fact, save the souls of the entire national populace, organizing benevolent reform movements, including the movement to stop the drinking of alcohol, that is, the temperance movement. With publications such as the Drunkard's Progress, which you see here to the right, temperance advocates hope to use, quote, moral suasion to convince men that drinking liquor was sinful and contributed to the breakdown and heartache of the American family. Temperance societies were organized nationally in big cities like New York, with thousands of auxiliary chapters spread across the towns and counties of the western states. And so it seemed that the entire country, with sufficient organization, sufficient initiative, sufficient revenue, might be made perfect in a Christian evangelical sense, with the right mixture of capitalism, technology, and, as I say, religious reform. The Ohio Star newspaper, in its article from 1830, said, "Concerning the great national blessings which we enjoy, the perpetuity of our free republican institutions, the promotion of arts and civilization, the protection of trade and commerce, extended by which the means of communication and transportation are facilitated, suppression of vice, and the promotion of morality, concerning these there can be no difference among intelligent men," as if the entire country had rallied now on behalf of these reform causes. As society became more individualistic in the age of the market revolution, more materialistic, several questions arose, including what sorts of conflicts would be created by this country on the move. Thinking back, for example, to the Lowell Mills and the employment of young women as textile workers in those first American factories. The Ohio Observer newspaper suggested in 1834, in response to a walkout, a strike, a labor strike in Dover, New Hampshire, of girls protesting a wage cut. Quote, "If their wages are too small, let them peaceably return home, where they will always find ample employment and good families, without disgracing themselves and their sex by assuming the attitude of a rebellion and making themselves a public laughingstock." Obviously, little sympathy here from the Ohio Observer. The girls who walked out, the young women who went on strike to protest the cut in wages, saw themselves, I think, as in solidarity of material interests, but the larger society, at least in the view of this newspaper, saw them as something troubling, as young women who no longer were deferential to the authority of males, and particularly their bosses in the factory. Patriarchy, it seems, still reigned, and young women were expected to follow the authority of a patriarchal order. But clearly they had other ideas, and thus it suggested that there would be conflicts to come as the country, this United States of America, developed its economic interests and material interests, became more diversified and more complex in its population, all the while calling for a new moral order that would somehow save the souls of individuals in the country alike. Yeah, this was a complicated tableau here, and it seems that other conflicts would be almost inevitable on the horizon to come. All right, that's part one of the market revolution. We'll return to part two to follow this line of analysis during this critical period in America.